The House of Drear, Chapter 8, Part 1. It will just have to hold until morning. I can get into town then and buy a new lock. Maybe 2 or 3 locks, the way things look here. India. Can you beat it? That's the puzzle. Mr. Small was speaking to himself. He wasn't aware that Mrs. Small and Thomas listened to him, so intent he was on his work at the kitchen door. He had been working on the door for the past 10 minutes. He had looked out once, right after Mr. Pluto had disappeared into darkness, and then he had spent a few minutes trying to slam the door shut. But without the spring lock, the door wouldn't stay closed. He had taken 2 dinner knives and slid them in the groove of the door frame. One knife he placed by the lock and the other just below the doorknob. He then slid the latch in place. No, no, Mr. Small muttered to himself. Something else, something different. Was it about the head? No, that was all right. Perhaps the neck, the shoulders? If I could have just realized the difference when I shook his hand. If I could put my finger on it. That's what it was. The gloves. He's trying to conceal his hands. He might have burned himself badly. I've told him the kind of work he does is too hard for a man his age, and being the superstitious man he is, he will be afraid to see a doctor. He will suffer with pain as best he knows how, because a doctor has supernatural power the same as a ghost. Thomas and Mrs. Small listened. They understood that something had to be haunting Mr. Pluto, whatever it was. Part of it had taken hold of Mr. Small. Although he was finished with the door, he still stood before it, talking to it as if it were alive. Good Lord, he was saying, the man is history. He doesn't have to leave this land, that other side of the hill, and yet he is running just as hard as the slaves had to run, as if he were one. He stays here, colliding with the past on the one hand and the present on the other. But does he mean to run with the one and away from the other, or run to both and pull them together? Here he stays. Now why? Why does he stay? And here we have an example of a notice and note signpost that we haven't talked about yet, but if you look on your bookmark, it's at the very bottom of one side, and it says when you're reading and a character asks himself a difficult question, you need to stop and ask yourself, what does this make me wonder? So I'm going to stop and ask myself, this idea of pulling the past and present together, asking that about Pluto. Why is Mr. Small asking that question? And what does that tell me about Mr. Pluto? Finally, Mr. Small sat down glumly at the kitchen table, with one hand cupped over his mouth. Thomas, after taking in the large, lopsided kitchen, sat down beside him. Mrs. Small busied herself by cleaning off the table and sweeping up all the broken dishes. She didn't utter a word to Thomas or his father. When she had finished, she deposited all the trash in an empty carton as quietly as she could. I think I could do with more coffee, Mr. Small said finally. His voice no longer held that feverish, crazy sound, Thomas noticed. If he goes around talking to some more doors, Thomas thought, I'm just going to have Mama take him to a hospital. It's still good and hot, Mrs. Small said. Thomas, will you have your coffee black too? Thomas was so surprised he couldn't think of anything to say. His mother never allowed him black coffee. What small amount of coffee she would permit him to have only came at Christmas or Thanksgiving, and then it was mostly cream and sugar with a dash of cinnamon. Oh, I know, Mrs. Small said to him, but you'd dearly love to have it strong and black the way your papa does. And since you're sitting here, well, it's your birthday. She poured 2 full cups of black coffee, placing 1 cup in front of Thomas and 1 in front of Mr. Small. She then poured a half a cup for herself and sat down between them. The smell of coffee filled the room. It flooded Thomas's mind with kitchen and coffee memories of long ago. Mr. Small raised his cup. Happy birthday, Thomas, he said quietly. Yes, Mrs. Small said, happy birthday. So it was that Thomas had his first full cup of bittersweet, black coffee. He felt so good sitting there in the new kitchen, in the new house with his mother and father. He felt as though he were at the center of whatever would happen next. Talk would happen next. He could tell that by his mother's excited face and his father's solemn one. They would talk things out the way they always had. Late at night, he'd often heard them in the kitchen talking things out, with that pure, hot smell of coffee filtering up to his room. Mama, Thomas said after a while. He had taken a few sips of coffee. Do you think now you are here and have seen everything that you'll ever want to go back home? Mrs. Small sat very still. Thomas thought she looked tired. He knew he was tired. All of them were. But he had to know right now how she felt about staying in the new house. And he knew none of them wanted to think about Mr. Pluto just yet. "No, Thomas," said Mrs. Small, "I don't think so. Your father and I have moved around quite a bit, it's true. We traveled this whole country in a camper we made ourselves." "Looking and looking," Mr. Small said quietly. "We finally settled in North Carolina," said Mrs. Small, "and we stayed there a good long while. But it was never right for us. No, never go back." And I'm going to stop right there because the paragraph right before that, that one line where Mr. Small said quietly, "Looking, looking." I wonder what they were looking for. What were they moving all over the country looking for? So as a reader, that's just a question I have and wonder if it's going to be answered later. "And you won't be afraid of Mr. Pluto?" Thomas couldn't help asking. "Thomas," Mr. Small spoke sharply, "nobody talking about ghosts and chanting verse is going to scare us out of this house. Nobody is going to take it away from us." "Do you think he will try?" Thomas said. His father was silent. He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully, but said nothing. "Well," said Mrs. Small, as though to answer Thomas in clear